Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grace City. I'm so glad that you are here today. I want to ask you a question. I want to see if any of this sounds familiar to you. A people or a group of people that are uncertain about what the future may bring. Uncertainty about our future. Or maybe international chaos. Nations fighting with nations, different factions and within nations fighting against one another. Nobody seems to be getting along. There's not world peace, if you will. What about the presence of religious pluralism? That would just be a lot of different religions, a lot of different ideas of who God is and what he's calling us to, a place and a people where it seems like people believe all sorts of different things. Or maybe widespread corruption. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Institutional corruption. We see it everywhere there is an organization. That might be the church and companies and government and just in small groups of people that we may interact with. Or maybe this sounds familiar. Like it seems like the state of your faith or your faith tradition, or maybe the church that you belong to is in some sense of chaos or turmoil, like it's going through something, right? And you're not sure exactly how it's going to come out on the other side, which gets back to the uncertainty about the future. Well, if any of this sounds familiar to you, I think it's because where we currently live and the things that we're experiencing now have a striking resemblance to the audience and the context for the book that we're going to be studying for the next 6 weeks. You see, the audience and the context of the book of Ezekiel were people that were experiencing some of these very same things. And that's where we're going over the next 6 weeks, is this Old Testament book based around the visions and the messages that God gave to deliver to people through the prophet Ezekiel. I'm excited about this book. I chose this book well in advance of kind of the last series that we went through, but I love coming right out of the last series we did with the book of Ezekiel, because the first week of that last series, I talked about how important it is for us to really read the Bible the way it was meant to be read, to get the understanding and the knowledge and the wisdom out of that text according to the context in which it was written, according to the genre of the literature and the way that it was written, and according to the original intent of the author, which we believe every word written in our Bible was divinely inspired by God. Written down, maybe by men and women, but divinely breathed and inspired by God. And so if God had a reason for having these people write this down or communicate this message at that time, we need to approach saying, okay, knowing that, understanding, putting it in its context, how should that inform the way we live? How should that inform the way we think about God? So that's what we're going to do. Also, Ezekiel just happens to be one of those books that's very commonly misunderstood. It's very confusing if you don't kind of have some help along the way to kind of understand what's going on. And we'll get into that. I'm going to try and give you some insight into how you can better understand it. And certainly we cannot cover every chapter and verse of 48 chapters of Ezekiel in 6 weeks. So we're going to be taking a look at some different scenes and visions throughout the book and try and tie those together. I would encourage you to kind of read along and keep up over the course of this, but I wouldn't do so without some kind of assistance of like a commentary or maybe just, again, like the Bible Project app, something like that to really help you understand what's going on in a particular part of that particular book, all right? Before we get into this, I found something very helpful that I think I just want to share with you. Anytime like a modern reader goes back to an Old Testament prophet and reads a book and says, what am I supposed to take from this? What am I supposed to gather from this? How does this apply to my life? That kind of thing. I think there are some things that we need to remember about Old Testament prophecy. And so I found this. There's two scholars that put this together. This is just kind of a checklist of 4 reminders of what Old Testament prophecy is all about. The first is this. We have to remember that the prophets were covenant enforcement mediators. So the covenant was the relationship that God had established with his people between God and the Israelites, or God and the Jewish people as we may refer to them. And there were some terms to that covenant, terms to that contract or relationship. And so a prophet was used as a mediator between the two sides of that relationship. The second thing is that the prophet's their messages were not their own, but God's. And so this wasn't someone like a third party that's looking on these two parties to this covenant and saying, hey man, it seems like you're kind of out of line here and you're kind of out of line there. Like maybe we would hire a mediator or an arbitrator to do. This wasn't a consultant. This wasn't somebody just just with their own ideas. This was somebody divinely selected by God to communicate a message that was not creative or original to them. It was something that God told them to say, told them to do. The third is that the prophets were God's direct representatives. And so as they were speaking to their audience, they were speaking on behalf of God. And then the fourth is this kind of long sentence here. The prophet's message is unoriginal. All right, they didn't come up with it on their own. They were inspired by God to present to their generation, to their particular context, to their specific audience, the essential content of the original Mosaic covenants, warnings and promises. If you want to know what the warnings and promises of the original, we're thinking about the Abraham, when God came and kind of selected and said, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless your nation so that you'll be a blessing to other nations around you. A great place to go back and look on this would be Deuteronomy chapter 30. At the end of Deuteronomy chapter 30, there's kind of a summary, a couple paragraphs there in which Moses reminds the people these were the terms of our relationship. This is what God set up in terms of what we can expect from him and what he expects from us. It comes with warnings and promises or curses and blessings. And if we are going to read Old Testament prophecy and ask good questions, we should be asking the right questions. And so I'm going to give you two questions that I think are the right questions to ask regardless of the prophet you're going back to read. So that's Isaiah or Jeremiah or Daniel or one of the many minor prophets. You want to ask these questions. The first question you should ask is, what can I learn or what can we learn collectively about God based on the way he related to these people in these situations according to the covenant he had made with them? So the context is the people, the things they were going through or the things that they had carried out, and then the terms of their relationship with God. We have to take all of that into context to figure out what does this tell us about God. We just sang the song, same God. We believe God is the same today, yesterday, and forever. And so what we learn about God in the Old Testament, we know to be true about the God that we worship and serve as well. The second question that I think is important us to ask is how might what we learn about God influence and inform the way we live now based on our context, our situations, but specifically under the new covenant and the way of Jesus. Because I mentioned at the top of this that there are several things that maybe you're going to look at the context that these Israelites are in and go, man, that seems like something we're going through. There's a lot of religious pluralism. Everybody has an idea about God. There's a lot of corruption. I see that there too. There's so much that we have in common that I want to remind you there are a few key differences. And the biggest difference is that we live on this side of the cross. We live according to the new covenant that Jesus made with us that was accomplished through his death and resurrection on the cross. It's that new covenant that we celebrate and remind ourselves of each and every Sunday when we take communion, right? This is a new way of relating to God in which we can have the presence of God and his Spirit living within us, that we can relate to God, that we can approach God humbly, but we can go to God directly and not have to go through a go-between like either a prophet or a priest. And so there are some things that are different about the way God interacts with people now, his people now, from the way that we see and read about in the Old Testament. I just want to keep that in mind. But based on what we learn about God, how should we live life now? So if you want to turn your Bible, we're going to be in Ezekiel chapter 1 and 2 today. We're going to read a lot of the verses together. We're going to stop and pause. I'm going to point out a couple things, and then I'm going to share what I believe are a couple takeaways that might help us better understand where we're going in the weeks ahead. So starting in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, you find this. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, while I was among the exiles by the Kabar Canal, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. So this is Ezekiel writing, and everything that we read in Ezekiel, we believe was written down by him or by somebody working very closely with him. And what he's saying is, in the 30th year, in my 30th year, the year that I turned 30. And that's significant because he came from the tribe of Levi, which means at the age of 30, he would have been ripe and ready to become a priest. That was the year you stepped into that role as a priest. It also happens to be the same year that Jesus was kind of commissioned to living out the ministry and leadership part of his life as well. But in his 30th year, even though he had been exiled, which we're going to talk about just a second, he was sitting by this canal. This canal is off the Euphrates River on the southeastern side of Babylon. And what he says here, he says, as he continues in verse 2, on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile. So this provides some reference. We know exactly the year in history that he wrote these things, or at least that he had this first vision. He probably wrote this book over a course of about 22 years, but this particular first vision that he's about to tell us about happened in 593 BC. That was the 5th year following the exile of King Jehoiakim and about 10,000 other people. And in verse 3 he says, "The word of the Lord came directly to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans," which is another way of describing the Babylonians. Those two can be interchanged. "By the Kabar Canal," that's where he was. "The Lord's hand was on him there." So to understand Ezekiel, you need to understand Ezekiel is known as the prophet of visions. The book of Ezekiel is often known as the book of visions. There are 52 distinct and unique visions, oracles they're called, a divinely inspired or God-given vision or message that God wanted Ezekiel to have and relay to his audience. And every time one of these visions comes up, if you're reading chapter 1 through 48, they're all going to start with either one of these two phrases. The word of the Lord came to me, or the Lord's hand was on me. And so if you see one of those two and you're reading through this, just highlight it. Remember, this is another one of those visions. This is another one of those oracles. This is another time that God came and gave him a message to relay to his audience. So to understand kind of where we are contextually in the life of history, how does this relate to the birth of Jesus, for instance, which most people believe, around, there wasn't a year zero, by the way. I found this out, and there's a 1 BC and a 1 AD. But most people believe Jesus was born probably somewhere around 4 BC, and that they just kind of caught up a little bit later with like the whole renumbering things based around his life. But this is 593 years before Jesus was born. It happens to be about 500 years after the nation of Israel kind of became a nation with a king as well. So I just want to trace through the history of the Old Testament. We're going to nerd out for about 5 minutes. And if you're not down with nerding out, then there's a bathroom available right now. That's all I want you to know. This might be your only time to get in there without waiting. But let's track it if we will. Going back to Genesis, all right? Genesis, we have the creation of the world. We have Noah and his ark. And then we have God selecting Abram, calling him Abraham and saying, you, Abraham, are going to be the father of many nations. And Abraham gives us a line of patriarchs, right? Each one of his sons kind of serving as the representative of God, leading this nation that God had selected. The last of those is Jacob and his son Joseph. And Joseph was the one, of course, sold into slavery by his brothers. And Joseph makes his way to Egypt. And it just so happened that God knew what he was doing all along, because when famine struck the land of Israel, it was this amazing opportunity to find resources in Egypt that God allowed Jacob's family to move the Israelite nation into Egypt. Originally going to Egypt was a really good thing. But as you fast forward into Exodus, of course, you find out that the Israelites grew in number. They became a threat to the Pharaoh. They were enslaved and treated terribly. And the rest of the book of Exodus is, of course, the story of how God brought a way for the Israelites to be redeemed and brought out of Egypt into the wilderness. Ultimately, his plan was to send them straight to the promised land. They kind of messed that whole thing up. And so they were in the wilderness for years, an entire generation. We see that play out through the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that kind of stuff. And then we get to Joshua. We get to the 6th book of the Bible, and Joshua has taken the mantle from Moses as the leader of these people, and it is his charge now to lead them into the promised land. And the very first battle fought in the promised land, where they knew they were going to have victory, was the Battle of Jericho. That's where you get the song you learned in Sunday school. If you didn't get raised in the church, you really missed out on that one, because it's a great song. He fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. That's all you need to know. But that was the first in a series of battles in which God provided them victory and a place to stay, a promised land, a place where they no longer had a temporary tabernacle or a temporary temple, but they could find a place where they could really build a temple. And at this time, they were led, the leadership of the nation of Israel was a combination of priests and judges. Think about this as like a spiritual leader, and then more of kind of like a government or military leader. And judges were raised up anytime there was either a dispute that needed judgment, or anytime that there was a neighboring nation that was coming to conquer or to attack. God would raise up a judge. And the whole book of Judges, as depressing as it may be, is God's story of raising up broken, flawed humans and trying to rescue the Israelites, and the Israelites just basically couldn't get out of their own way. So fast forward again through some of the other books, you got Ruth and some of the others, and in 1 Samuel, finally, the nation of Israel asks for a king. Samuel is this final priest. He has kind of put up his sons as the judges at the time, and what we find out is they didn't follow the Lord. They were corrupt. And what was happening to the nation is that they were looking around at all the neighboring countries and saying, man, they have it so good. And the reason they have it so good, at least in their mind, is because they have a king. And we don't have a king. And so maybe we could have it better if we had a king. So they come to Samuel and they say in 1 Samuel 8, give us a king. Tell God we want a king. So Samuel goes and they have this back and forth conversation with the Lord. And the Lord's like, listen, give them what they want. They're going to regret this decision because no king is going to be great. They're going to find that a human leader cannot provide the kind of sovereign love and care that I want to provide for them. But go ahead and give them what they want. And so they ultimately had the first king Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, and then an entire line of many others. And it was under Solomon that the great temple was built. He was the one that was kind of carrying out the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the holiest of holies, the place in the middle of that temple where they believed the presence of the Lord lived, that's where God lived. And he lived among them, but he was there with them. So that kind of sets up everything. And then we kind of go through this. In 930, so we're back here at 970, right, with Solomon. In 930, there's a civil war. The nation splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. You've probably heard about that. A little bit confusing. The north is known as Israel. The south is known as Judah. They have their own kings. There's lines of them you can trace. In 723, a world power known as Assyria comes onto the scene, and they attack and conquer the northern kingdom. All right, so they take that particular side. The southern kingdom still existing on its own. In 612, so about 100 years later, Babylon steps onto the scene as another world power, and they say, Assyria, get out of our way, we're now the boss. And so they conquer that same northern kingdom, and then they take over leadership of the northern kingdom. Fast forward to 605. Nebuchadnezzar, you probably read that if you read in the Old Testament. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon makes his first attack of the southern kingdom. So this is the first time that they're being invaded by a world power, and that southern kingdom's capital is Jerusalem. At his first attack, the first time he came in, he took some captives. He brought some exiles back with him. And among those that he brought back were the prophet Daniel along with his companions. Now you may know there's a church right down the road that started Daniel today. Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah were all contemporaries of one another. They were all experiencing basically the same set of events. And God selected and ordained each one of those three as his messengers, his mouthpiece to different audiences. As you read the book of Daniel, you'll see that Daniel's primary audience was King Nebuchadnezzar. It was the leadership of the Babylonian Empire. If you read Jeremiah, you realize that Jeremiah's audience were those who were left behind in Jerusalem, that he was not exiled. But Ezekiel had a different thing, because we find here in 598, Babylon attacks Jerusalem for a second time. Basically, this guy, King Jehoiakim, he was kind of a puppet king set up, just kind of allowed to continue running things under the leadership of Babylon. And he decided he was going to rebel because he's an idiot. And he rebelled. And so ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and kind of squashes that whole rebellion, pulls King Jehoiakim and 10,000 others, including Ezekiel, out in 598. The exile happened in 597, but it's 593 when Ezekiel receives this vision that we're going to read about, and you can read about in chapters 1 through 3. So that's where we are in the timeline of history, 593 years before Jesus came back. And we continue reading in verse 4. I looked, this is Ezekiel writing, I looked and there was a whirlwind coming from the north, a huge cloud with me flashing back and forth, and brilliant light all around it. In the center of the fire there was a gleam like amber. The likeness of 4 living creatures came from it, and this was their appearance. So he's describing this vision that he has. They looked something like a human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, the soles of their feet were like the hooves of a calf, sparkling like the gleam of polished bronze. They had human hands under their wings on their 4 sides. All 4 of them had faces and wings. Their wings were touching. The creatures did not turn as they moved. Each one went straight ahead. Their faces looked something like the face of a human, and each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right, the face of an ox on the left, and the face of an eagle, which we can only assume was in the back. That is what their faces were like. Their wings were spread upward. Each had 2 wings touching that of another, and 2 wings covering its body. So if you kind of get the image, you got these 4-faced creatures, and they have 4 wings, 2 of the wings to the side, and those are kind of touching their neighboring creature, if you will, and then 2 down below. Each creature went straight ahead, and this is fascinating. I'm going to point this out a couple of different times. And in verse 12, this is the first time we read, wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went without turning as they moved. The likeness of the living creatures was like the appearance of blazing coals of fire, or like torches. There's a lot of imagery being used by Ezekiel here, and I'm going to point out a couple of it. Anytime there's a reference to fire, we think about the idea of judgment. We think about the idea of refining or purification. And so the many times he talks about lightning and fire and things like that, we understand that this being, this presence that's coming, is bringing a message of judgment, that there's going to be refining or purification that's going to happen. Fire was moving back and forth between the living creatures. It was bright, with lightning coming out of it. The creatures were darting back and forth like flashes of lightning. When I looked at the living creatures, there was one wheel on the ground beside each of the four-faced creatures. The appearance of the wheels and their craftsmanship was like the gleam of beryl. He's using a lot of construction, jewels and metals, things that have great value to try and describe what can only be an indescribable experience for him. Right? He's really struggling to put words to this to help them understand. So he's used bronze. He uses beryl. We're going to see a couple others in just a minute. It says, their appearance and craftsmanship was like a wheel within a wheel. So like a gyroscope, if you will, that doesn't have to turn. It can go in any direction, as he mentioned before. When they moved, they went in any of the four directions without turning as they moved. Their four rims were tall and awe-inspiring, completely covered with eyes, which brings to light the idea of like the omniscience of God, the fact that he sees and knows everything. Verse 19, when the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. And when the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, here it is for a second time, the creatures went in the direction the Spirit was moving. The wheels rose alongside them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, the wheels moved. When the creatures stopped, the wheels stopped. When the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose alongside them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Over the heads of the living creatures, the likeness of an expanse was spread out. So if you have these four creatures with their wings all kind of touching, you have some sense of a square, right? And above that square, almost as a platform on that square, he describes this expanse. One of the cool Bible nerd things is that this word expanse is the same word used in Genesis 1:6 when God is creating the heavens and the earth, and he talks about how he puts an expanse between the land and the clouds, or between the land and the sky, that the expanse in between what we might know as like the environment around us, the wind and the waves and things, that was the expanse, same word. So he's trying to help them understand what he's seeing. The likeness of an expanse was spread out. It gleamed like awe-inspiring crystal, another allusion there to a very popular stone. And under the expanse, their wings extended one toward another as the expanse kind of rested on them. They each also had two wings covering their bodies. When they moved, I heard the sound of the wings like the roar of a huge torrent, like the voice of the Almighty, and a sound of tumult like the noise of an army. When they stopped, they lowered their wings. A voice came from above the expanse over their heads when they stopped, and they lowered their wings. Something like a throne with the appearance of lapis lazuli. That's another very famous, it's actually a blue stone. We still use it to this day, but very precious at this time. With the appearance of lapis lazuli was above the expanse over their heads. Here we get to the fun stuff. On the throne, high above, was someone who looked like a human. All right, so he's having this vision. These creatures that he can't even describe. He's giving them, they're all four different faces. They got four wings. They got hands under the wings. I mean, creeping him out. You got to imagine, I have never seen anything like this. You can see he's struggling to find the words to describe what he's seeing. But when he finally gets to the place where he looks above these creatures and he looks on this expanse or on this platform, this level, he sees this throne. And sitting on the throne is someone that he believes is like a human. And it reminds me that at the same time that he's having this vision, right? Maybe within just a few years of this, Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who got thrown into the fire, are present when Nebuchadnezzar looks into that furnace. You remember what I'm talking about? And they're there, and Nebuchadnezzar's asking, he said, didn't you throw three into the fire? And his people were asking, of course we threw three into the fire. Then why is it that I see four? And he says, the fourth is that like a God, or like the Son of God, depending on the translation. There are multiple visions happening of this human-like divine presence at this particular time. God is at work, and it just reminds me that Jesus wasn't invented at the nativity, right? Like John tells us that, John 1:1, like the Word was God, the Word was with God, everything was created through him. But oftentimes we think of like God the Father, maybe the Spirit hovering above the waters. This talks about Jesus, and it's like Jesus arrived on the scene in 4 BC. And I think what we see are these little, just these little windows and glimpses of like the Son of God, maybe even Jesus himself stepping into the Old Testament at times before finally he enters in with human flesh into human history like we know he did. From what seemed to be his waist up, I saw a gleam like amber with what looked like fire enclosing it all around. From what seemed to be his waist down, I also saw what looked like fire. There was a brilliant light all around him, so we couldn't make out exactly what he was, and there's a reason for that. The appearance of the brilliant light all around was like that of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. This was, and this is very important, the appearance of the likeness of the Lord's glory. So as Ezekiel is sitting here and he's receiving this vision, he sees everything he's seeing, he realizes, oh my gosh, I am coming as close as humanly possible to seeing the presence of God. This is a visible manifestation of God. God had told Moses in the Exodus 33:20 that no one can look into the face of God and live. Right? Because Moses has been like, man, I want to see you. I want to know who it is that's sending me with all these things to lead these people. And we see that in Exodus, where God's like, no, you can't look into my face. And so they come with this arrangement where his face is kind of veiled, and God says, you can kind of see the back of me as I come by you. And Ezekiel is realizing, I can't look into the face of God, but he's giving me an actual look at something close to the glory of his glory, the weight of his glory. And that word glory, it's a Hebrew word, kabod. It means weight. It means splendor. It is his abundant presence manifested visually so that Ezekiel can kind of just catch a glimpse of how great God is. And we see that this was so overwhelming that his response was to fall down. It says, when I saw it, I fell face down and I heard a voice speaking. And in this face down response, what we see is the posture that was assumed by those who went in front of a king. He realized he was in the presence of the divine. And so he fell face down. Also in this posture is this openness to hearing God speak. And this is maybe the first time, like at the end of the first chapter, we press pause and just ask ourselves the question, in light of who God is, in light of how we see Ezekiel respond to this vision of God, what is the posture of our heart? Are we open to God actually speaking? Have we closed ourselves off? I was having coffee with a friend earlier this week, and she was talking about how some others in her church were a little bit jealous of the way that she talks about her communication with God, that it seemed to be so open and so intimate. And they're like, how do you talk to God like that? Like, how do you hear God's voice and all those kinds of things? And she and I were talking about this. She's like, I almost had a hard time explaining it to them. And I kind of talked them through what God's led me through to get to this place where I can have that kind of relationship with him. But it's just, there's a posture. There's a posture about saying, like, God, if you were to speak, if you wanted to reveal something to me, I would actually receive it. Like, I think I see that sometimes when I look around this room and you guys are worshiping with your hands up or your hands out, and it's almost like this physical posture that's reminding ourselves, like, I'm here for you, speak to me, fill me up, whatever it is you have. And it begs the question, what can we do to put ourselves into that posture? How can we get our heart postured more to being open to God? Like, would it freak you out if you felt like God was saying something to you? Would it freak you out if God showed up in a way that you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't see this coming? And how would you respond? Would you run away? Or would you fall face down and go, all right, man, you caught me. What is it that you want to say? Just a great reminder and a great response from Ezekiel. Okay, we're going to finish it out with the first 7 verses of chapter 2, because this is why God came to talk to him. He said to me, God said to Ezekiel, Son of man, stand up on your feet and I will speak with you. You're going to see this phrase, Son of man. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that when Jesus used the phrase Son of man, specifically in one of the Gospels, it was a reference to the way Daniel used that phrase. Daniel used the phrase Son of man as almost a way of foreshadowing what the Messiah would be like. When the Son of Man comes, he would say a few times in Daniel. And so when Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man, it's a way of him identifying himself as the Messiah. When God addresses Ezekiel as Son of Man, it is the way of him saying, you are human, you are mortal. You are human, you are mortal, and what you are about to receive is divine. You are not. So he says, Son of man, stand up on your feet and I will speak with you. And as he spoke to me, look what it says. The Spirit of God entered me and set me on my feet. I didn't stand up, but the Spirit of God entered me and set me on my feet. And I listened to the one who was speaking to me. He said to me, here's his message, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, that's your audience, To the rebellious pagans who have rebelled against me, the Israelites and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this day. So we start to understand the context of what the Israelites have been going through and what they've chosen. Verse 4, the descendants are obstinate, they're stubborn, they're hard-hearted. I'm sending you to them, and you must say to them, this is what the Lord God says. So you're not making up your own words. Your message is not original. I'm giving you the message to say. You are my spokesman. Whether they listen or refuse to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. But you, son of man, there it is again, do not be afraid of them. Do not be afraid of their words, even though briars and thorns are beside you and you live among scorpions. Don't be afraid of their words or discouraged by the look on their faces, for they are a rebellious house. Speak my words to them, whether they listen or refuse to listen, for they are rebellious. Right? When it said there in verse 2 or verse 3 of that chapter, it said, the Spirit entered me and put me on my feet. The thing that I want you to see is that it was the Spirit of God that came into Ezekiel that prepared him to receive this commissioning, to receive this job, to receive this thing that God wanted him to do. It was only the Spirit. Ezekiel could not have received it on his own, but through the Spirit, he could understand, receive, and carry out God's instructions. And it reminds me, just write this down and look it up in your devotional, your small group, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 6 through 16. Paul spends about 11 verses talking about the role that the Spirit plays in our life to understand the things of God. That we can't understand the things of God. It's actually the Spirit in us that's almost like a translator, enabling us and equipping us to understand spiritual things that are beyond. That it's the Spirit that initiates that. It's the Spirit that comes into us, just like he did in Ezekiel, to receive what God wants us to have. Right? And so if we're going to ask those questions that I mentioned before, if we're going to ask the questions, what do these things teach us about a God who would deal with his people in this way? The first thing, kind of based on that last thing I think there, is we need to understand that the Spirit of God initiates and pursues. It was the Spirit of God who came to Ezekiel as he's sitting on the bank of the Kabar Canal. It was the Spirit of God that filled Ezekiel up and lifted him to his feet to be able to receive this message that God was going to give him. That everything we do that we think might be coming to God is in fact actually a response to a God that has already pursued us and initiated up with us. John Wesley called it prevenient grace. It was the grace of God that was working in our life before we even became aware of the fact that maybe God was existing or was moving on our behalf. It was ultimately what we saw in God's grand gesture of sending Jesus into earth as the initiator, as the pursuer. It's the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in Genesis 1-2, where God created things, initiating them and starting them. That's what God does. The second thing we see is that the Spirit of God goes and moves wherever he pleases. We saw that in verse 12 and we saw that in verse 20, right? In verse 12, it said, wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went without turning as they moved. And in verse 20, it said, wherever the Spirit wanted to go, the creatures went in the direction of the Spirit was moving. God is going to move wherever he wants to move and whenever he wants to move. We cannot spur God to move. We cannot back him into a corner so that he has to react to us. God is the initiator and the pursuer. No more can we back God into a corner and provoke him to move than can we stifle or prevent him from moving. Like God exists and moves beyond our power. We have no power to stifle the movement of God. And then the third thing is this. The presence of God is committed to being with his people. This is something that wasn't really clear from the text, but it will become clear as you read through chapters 3 through 8 and into 9, 10, and 11. But as I mentioned before, when the Israelites were roaming the wilderness, they had this kind of tent-like tabernacle they would set up. And finally, when Solomon allowed them to build a temple, there was a Holy of Holies, and there was the Ark of the Covenant there. And that was where they believed the presence of the Lord lived, that he lived among them because he was there in the temple. When Ezekiel sees this presence of the Lord present on the bank of the Kabar Canal, he comes to the realization that the presence of the Lord has left the temple. It is no longer back where the people used to be. The presence of the Lord has actually followed the people into exile. That there was a massive adjustment of Ezekiel's understanding of the presence of God and what he wanted. And what he saw was a Spirit of God that was moving and initiating and pursuing and wanting to be present, even with his people, even as he was preparing to judge and discipline his people, he wanted to be near them. And it reminds me of this psalm, Psalm 139, verse 7, which the psalmist writes, where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there, and if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I fly on the wings of the dawn and settle down on the western horizon, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will hold on to me. So in light of a God that initiates and pursues, in light of a God who initiates and pursues, in light of a God who moves whenever and wherever he wants, in light of a God who's going to pursue his people and follow his people because he wants to be present with his people, how then shall we live? How should this inform and impact the way that we live? I think it's very simple. We need to be open. We need to be open to the movement of God. We need to posture our heart to be ready to receive what he has for us. We need to be humble. We need to think to ourselves, like, what power do we have in view of the presence and the power of God, of the Spirit that moves wherever he wants? Humble, say, God, if you were to move in my life, I am open to that. I want you to move. To invite him to do that and wait for him to move at the right time and the right place. And then obviously, we've got to be ready. We've got to be encouraged, because a God that wants to be present with us obviously loves us. Like, we're not going to run God off. He has given us the Holy Spirit. And that's the beautiful thing about living on this side of the cross. The new covenant is that we have the presence of God living within us. The big idea of Ezekiel is that God is going to purify his people, and then he's going to live with them forever. At the end of this book, we're going to see a vision, or really a vision of heaven, a vision of a new Jerusalem with a new temple, a vision that's also communicated in the book of Revelation. But before they get there, God has to take care of some things. He has to judge them. He has to discipline them. He has to refine them and purify them so that he can live with them forever. This book was originally written to warn and encourage people who are in exile. But I believe as we read this book, it offers hope to anyone who will put their trust in the Lord. We're going to see echoes of the gospel. We're going to see insight into God's heart and mind and his design from the beginning. And more than anything, I believe as you read this, you're going to see and be reminded of God's everlasting love for his people, who wants to be near us and with us forever. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for this week. I thank you for just the ability to look back through the timeline of history, really the timeline of your story and the way that you have loved and led and interacted with your people from the very beginning. God, we find our place in history, God, at this point in time, but we know that you're the same God now that you were then. And so we're thankful for the records that were written down, for the stories and the prophecies and the visions that were cared for and taken care of, that we may get insight into the way that you dealt with people then, and we can see your heart and your faithfulness as you carry out your old covenant, knowing, God, that you have given us direct access through your Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, we pray these things in his name. Amen.